Hi, Edward.
Hey, Geena.
It's lovely to have you here.
Thank you.
We have this space today to talk about design and innovation strategy and kind of unpack the concepts of strategic design and management. And this could be valuable for companies who want to become more resilient in the future, or any future students of the strategic design program, or really anyone out there who wants to strengthen their creative confidence. So today I'm here with Edward Cardimona, professor at Parsons School of Design here in New York City, a mentor for many students, and courses in design sprints, project facilitation, and entrepreneurship strategy. He's a global design leader who reinvents, re-energizes, and re-engages global brands. He has experience as chief creative officer and worked with global brands like Nike, IKEA, and celebrity brands like Serena Williams, Cindy Crawford, and Lebron James. So welcome, Edward.
Welcome. Yay. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited for this. Maybe we can start by kind of defining what strategic design is. I know we talked about this before, that whenever you ask someone what's strategic design to you, people are answering differently every time. So I kind of dived into my own definition, and I think it's mostly about connecting creative problem solving with strategic decision making, kind of bringing left and right brain together, because oftentimes the creative isn't feasible enough in the economy and the business isn't human enough. So when people ask me, I give this like really abstract definition.
Right.
I say, let's apply design methods to business strategy, which makes sense in my head, but it's incredibly like meta and high level. So maybe, do you have a go-to elevator pitch when people ask you?
Mine may even be more meta.
Okay.
I think it's an interesting concept because everyone knows the word strategic and everyone knows the word design. So it comes with a lot of equity, and we need to be the ones to help them kind of bring those two terms together, or people will just kind of make it up. Mm-hmm. So on a 30,000 foot level, I help people navigate chaos. On like a 20,000 foot level, I'm always looking to find the future, and then I design backwards. So I use a lot of the strategic design methodologies to kind of change my course or my trajectory. One of my favorite quotes, which I'll bastardize, but you'll get where I'm going. Kierkegaard said, you have to understand life backwards, but live it forwards. Mm. And that's always been kind of in my mindset when it comes to strategic design. I think that everyone can dream and everyone can be creative. Few people really believe, though, and strategic design methodologies really help sort of transverse from dreaming to believing, which is the business side of what you're talking about, so that businesses can actually see the future and feel like their associates, their business, their audience lives will be better with this new path.
Absolutely. I think also because oftentimes these titles are so varied. Like you can be a creative strategist, you can be a design strategist, you can be called an innovation consultant. There are so many terms. And it's kind of like, I thought about like a quick fix maybe for calling the program or explaining the program as strategy design instead of strategic design, because we're using design and plugging it into business operations, and calling it design strategy or strategic design often sounds like we're product designers or something and
right.
Just adding a level of strategy, but we're using like the creative resources we have to inform strategy. So
right.
somehow.
No, I agree. I mean, I think there's definitely ways to reframe this. I always go back to the way you started, which is I ask myself, how do I define it? And how do I tell my friends and families and business colleagues?
Yeah.
If you ask 20 people what it is, you're going to get 20 different answers. But as strategists, we really need to have the definition clear in our own mind and heart before we can share it with others. So I don't really care what the title is. I don't think that anyone that is a futurist or is a strategist should ever look to achieve a title. It's really about loving that messy process that is strategy.
Absolutely. We'll move into the messy process in a while. But essentially, we're using this to address complex 21st century dilemmas. So what are one or two of your most compelling dilemmas that strategic design can help solve in the future?
I have a lot of them. And I think if we were talking a year ago, my list would be different. And a year before that, my list would be different again. I've been studying for the last couple of years the difference between accountability and responsibility. And I believe, we had one definition in the last century of many people being responsible, but only one person being accountable. I believe the context of our world now is asking us to be accountable for each other. So I think we're moving to, or I would love to see us moving toward businesses that are co-accountable and, a society that is co-accountable. Because that really means that you will lean in with compassion and empathy because you care about your colleagues, you care about society. So that's one that I look at. AI, again, it's been sort of talked about ad nauseum, but the AI-human relationship is probably going to be the biggest disruptor in your life, in my life, in the 21st century. So we now have a partner or an agent, or we're now going through life from this day forward, co-creating. We just are. So that's tough for our human egos to wrap ourselves around. So I study that. That's, again, another dilemma. And I don't mean dilemma like in a bad way. I just mean we no longer live in the world of our parents and grandparents, which is a world of problems to be solved. It's really about dilemmas that need to be sort of continually altered and evolved that never really have solutions because they're open-ended, they're dynamic, and they change with the context of our world. So AI-human relationship is really interesting to me. This idea of being a techno-human rather than a human. Power. I've been studying power a lot, sort of the power-peace dynamic, and how we're redefining power, which is being redefined. And then this isn't really a sort of a tension point, because I'm really just focused on one aspect of it, but it's this idea of trust. So, you and I have talked before about brands and, where we find solace. In the past, it might be organized religion, it might have been the government, it might have been our parents, it might have been our teachers. There was a sense of trust. You and I now live in a world where we don't trust anything. So how do you go forward and engage people as a thought leader, or as a strategic leader, when no one trusts anything? So trust is another sort of 21st century dilemma I'm looking at.
Absolutely. I think they're also all kind of interconnected. Like when you said power is about trust, it can also be about leadership, and the one that's responsible, if he's doing it right, can be the trusted leader and have more power. But then the team has to be co-accountable. So I feel like they can influence each other. But maybe we can try to weave in all of these dilemmas in our conversation today.
So let me just interrupt a moment, because
sure.
You brought up something regarding everything is connected to everything. It's no surprise that today is Leonardo da Vinci's birthday. And he's really was the first strategic designer, in my opinion, who believed that everything was connected to everything. So you sort of fast forward, I don't know, he'd be 500 and some years old today. You kind of fast forward and we're looking at the same challenges of we have all these signals and trends, and how do we connect the dots?
That's fascinating.
Because everything is connected to everything. No, I think it's great that we're talking on his birthday.
Yeah.
It was meant to be.
Yeah, it's destiny for some reason.
Right?
Let's talk about the mindset of strategic design versus the roles. So some companies operate very top down in their innovation approach, where they say, I want to be innovative, so we need a design unit. And then they establish that unit, but only accept around 1% of those ideas because the others seem too far out of the box or not core to the brand. So I guess there's this missing sense of urgency to try out those ideas, because once things go down in the market, that design unit is either the one that now has to save them, which is kind of too late maybe, or it's the first to be let go because they're cutting back to their basic business operations. But if things are changing and those basic operations aren't working anymore, cost cutting to them won't really save you. So how do you think a bottom-up approach where a strategic designer could come into the organization could save a business in the long run and make it resilient?
It's a great point. And I think, we can talk ad nauseum about strategy and the methodologies, but ultimately in business, it's human to human, or human to technology to human, right? So I believe the magic actually happens between the bottom up and the top down. I think both happen. We no longer live in a century or the context of our lives where one person or one team can solve everything, which is that old kind of 20th century top down, just, glass, office in the corner, CEO kind of thing. Now it's really about bottom up and top down, and then the two coming together and creating this kind of magical, never before seen, we don't live in a time of a status quo or paradigm. So it's really about like, let's discover this together. Let's build it together. So that's kind of my long answer for, top down, bottom up. I think, a lot of this has to do with businesses have an innate fear. And I know we're going to talk about fear a little later, but, businesses have an innate fear that because the world has changed so dramatically in this century versus the last century, that it's not that they can't see the changes they need to make, but it takes courage, because the context of the world is so different than when their idea was concepted, when the DNA of the brand started, that it would mean a huge shift in human, in skill set, in associates, in size, in Wall Street. And I mean, it's just such a hyper change that, I like to say, or I like to think about these moments as, yes, the world might be changing in like 180 degree ways. But if we can make a 5% change, let's open the champagne and have pizza.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because over, 8, 10, 12 billion people, it's huge. A little 5% change.
Yeah.
Now, we don't craft it as saying we just want to make this, it's just going to be a 5%. But we have to help people see that the 5% change, when it actually affects society, will be massive. And I think some strategists, because we're able to see the bigger system and map the bigger system, believe that we can change the bigger system like at once. And that's not realistic. So that's why I look at it's the little wins, it's the little 5% trajectory. Some people talk about the 1%, like small. But when you have so many people and you have all of us being so hyper-connected because of technology, a 1% change is a huge change.
Yeah, I agree. It's also what I've been thinking about, investing into new niche markets that are growing and having kind of your seeds spread out. And then once one seed starts growing, you can immediately go there and integrate it into your business model and make it kind of more resilient in your future, even though it might not make sense to invest in the short term. It does in the long term with this kind of goal of incremental change, like you say. So in consulting, for example, strategic design is always very like applied design to the next user experience, the next landing page, the next campaign. And I was thinking, that it's shrinking the mindset that we're learning to a very small part, even though the mindset is so much larger. So I'm wondering, how can we not lose this strategic, freely creative, systemic overview of a business in the face of global change, while also like tackling these short-term tangible outcomes, but then thinking back to, oh, does this actually make sense in the bigger picture?
Yeah. No, I get it. Again, I think it goes back to accountability. We have to be leaders as well as teachers. And I think the teaching part takes time, takes empathy, and sometimes strategists will jump the teaching part and just say, you just don't want the big idea, or we can't afford the big idea. But we have to own that perhaps we didn't tell the story in a way that really engaged our audience. This isn't, I believe that, we're not living in a time of I and me. We're living in a time of we and us. So, as brilliant as we all might be and as learned and as, thought leaders as we are, we still can't do it alone. Mm. And that means I have to be able to tell a story that engages you in a way that you'll be able to see that future and co-create the future where you will believe that your life will be better than it is today. Once you do that, people change. Like, it's a great tool, whether, my life has been corporate, like large corporations. It's a great way of not changing minds, but changing mindsets when people actually put themselves in the future of where we're going. So I think that's, super, super helpful. Again, I go back to believing, a business or a firm in the 21st century has to believe that they can no longer do what they did yesterday. Yeah. And that's tough, but that's where we come in and we say, we're not scared. We continue to build our creative courage. We continue to build our future foresight. Like, whatever it is, whatever tools that we believe we can incorporate, we need to help them kind of have a sense of, I'm going to make this through. That's why I said, I often say I'm leading people through chaos. Mm-hmm. I'm going to make it through this chaos. I would say the number one fault that I've seen in large corporations is they try to do the next right thing, thinking it's a prediction. So I'm going to do this tomorrow, then I'm going to do this tomorrow, the next day, and I'm going to do this the next day, as opposed to where are we going? Mm. You and I don't know what 15 years in the future is going to bring. So design that futurescape and then have that inform your steps. I once worked with a really brilliant CEO from Brazil, this huge kind of Brazilian portfolio company. And he was, they were very wealthy and they acquired a lot of businesses. Well, when you acquire a business, people come with it, right? You just don't like buy a brand mark. No. So I remember so clearly one day he called me into his office and he said, "Oh my gosh, like I didn't realize that people come with it." Like with the purchase. Yeah. When people come with the purchase, that's the part you have to focus on. And that's where I say we have to be great storytellers as design strategists, because the stories are how we learn, how we engage, how we connect to people. It's a very, the language of brands, the language of commerce is very personal. It's about going toward love. It's not just this transactional, you give me your $2 and I'll give you my widget. It's really about love. And you think about some of the great global brands today, they're courageous in how they consistently show us that they care for the relationship they have with us, and we'll go to the end of the earth for them. We just do. I mean, we don't use that language, but we
Technically,
do. We'll wait 6 months for a Birkin bag. Yeah. We just will.
We invest a lot, yeah.
We just will. It means a lot to us on so many ways, so many, humans gain value, like it's a 360-degree circle how we gain value from things. So if you're just going to make the better microphone, then that's going to be, and not deliver any other value to me, that's going to be a transactional thing. I'll have no love for you. Mm. I'll love the product, but the next time I need a microphone, I'm going to shop around, right? It's these brands that sort of touch on all these points, emotional, psychological, social, because it's human. That's truly a human-centered approach for a business.
I agree. There's also this concept of a brand creating a mental model or a simulation for a consumer where they actually believe that this is the lifestyle I'm tapping into. So the microphone should come with a story of what a great podcaster you will be with this microphone, not only the technicality and like product specifics. But we'll talk about brands a bit later.
Okay.
So let's talk first about this messy creative process that we've mentioned so far. So I brought this past case example where my team was working on creating and maximizing the residual value of electronic cars of a rental company. And it started with this very outcome focus of maximizing this value.
Right.
But once you go through this messy process and talk with users, we went from outcome to behavior to psychology. And we noticed that the most value is in the battery. And like instead of the technicality of the battery that now has to be improved, we found out that the users weren't charging it properly. And that was the behavior level. And then we actually talked to the users and noticed that the users didn't know how to charge properly. And they also didn't care how to charge properly because it was a rental. So once you really nail into the root cause of this problem, that's where you get to this customer sentiment. And that's where you really can design the right solution afterwards. So that's like my go-to example when we talk about creative process, but how do you think we can integrate and trust this creative process in a firm that isn't familiar with it or that has very like is very deadline driven? How can you, as like one strategist, one creative strategist, go into this firm and like confidently go through this messy process with them?
Well, you touched on a few points. I think one is as people who love the process, as people who love sort of the interaction with not only the consumer but the end user, we have to continue to remind whichever firm or client we're working with that we have to keep going back to the people that make the context of our decision making, and that's the end user or the consumer. They will give us insight. So the challenge with designing with the future already in sight, and I've spoken with many strategists who will say, like in week 2, we're going to build an app. I'm like, okay, but in addition to who, what, where, why, when, I always add who cares and so what. Mm-hmm. And because those are human, those are the human things that really make people move. And we find that throughout kind of the second half of the last century into this century. If people care enough, they move. And the way they care is they connect themselves personally with whatever that future state is. They'll move. Warhol said, again, I'll bastardize the quote, but you can't force people to change, but when they decide to change, you can't stop them. And, because it's so sort of personal, it's so emotional, it's just not intellect. And so, this idea of making change, you can't push change on people. They will either fight back or they will be apathetic, who cares? And then as creative strategists in a business setting, the leadership will look on us to say, your creative was off. Mm. Or they'll look at marketing and say, the messaging was off. Or they'll look at sales and say the sales was off. Or they'll look at the user interface, that was off. When in fact, it's our job to remind them that we connected with consumers for the last 2 years. Let's say I'm making this up. 2 years prior to this project. And basically 60% said, I don't care. That means a lot. It's not going to be real neat. It's not going to fit into an MBA kind of, research formula. But that's why I say process and strategy are messy. Like you want to take a shower afterwards. Like they're just dirty.
Yeah.
And if your strategy and your process is super neat and clean, I would say you're not doing it quite right. Because there should be as many questions at the end as you have sort of answers and insights. And that's what I mean by messy, is that, as a strategist, we have to keep until the very end, keep interacting, keep nudging, keep championing, keep supporting the human process of what we're doing, because it changes faster than we can design.
You mentioned the fear of change, or when people don't really care or fight back when you push change. Maybe we have to create some sort of pull marketing for change. But it reminds me of the innovator's dilemma that goes back to Clayton Christensen in 1997, where it's basically about how businesses underestimate disruptors or any interventions that come in because they're new, as long as they don't have a certain percentage of market share yet. So this underestimating, one famous example is that Sony's PlayStation underestimated the Wii console that was coming into the market simply because they were looking at the tech again, like this microphone example. And they underestimated that another factor in there is the user experience. And we had a way better user experience that was interactive. You could play with friends and family. So maybe going into these factors, or maybe there's something else you would like to add. Why do you think it's so difficult for these legacy brands, because it's been working for 50 plus years, to accept that change is a constant and to kind of like accept that they aren't going to be the idea forever?
Yeah. Well, when you look at the 20th century, disruptive or interruptive change happened much slower, which means firms in the first half of the last century were able to kind of course correct and adjust. Firms in the second half were able to create new paradigms and mimic it. But the minute you see us heading toward the 21st century, and then all through the 21st century, we're getting bombarded with the kind of disruptive change that no firm can react to, fully. Again, firm being people. So that's why I'm always looking at people and fear, because it's a human reaction. Will I have the skills for this change? Will I be part of this change? I've described myself in society with my friends, with my professional network, as a certain person. Now, in this new world, in this new change, who am I? All of those things create, like, I call them, it's not really the correct term, but I call them like microaggressions. They create these dams in the process that kind of slow down the process, and they're usually human. Like, there's really nothing that we can think of that we can't figure out a technology to solve, to get ahead of technology. So it's not the mechanisms of our ideas, it's the human factor. Mm-hmm. And we have fear, because once we tap into love, or once we tap into joy, or once we tap into passion, once we can connect ourselves with where we're going, people dive in 110%. Whether it's in the workplace or outside the workplace, because I don't think there's a big change there. So I think that's a bit of the problem. The second thing I would say to your comment was, we as strategists are hardwired in a certain way, and we're hardwired to be able to step back and see the bigger system, map this bigger system, try to make sense of the bigger system, and then with courage, we start connecting dots and try to figure out, what's our best next step, right? Firms that don't engage us in that way, that view at sort of their world, or view what they believe tomorrow will bring, will not be able to disrupt that system. They're going to come in and they're going to find, in many cases, so many roadblocks in the bigger system that they're going to they're going to be sort of stunned. And I think a lot of legacy brands are in that place, whether it's architecture, agriculture, education. These things have these models have been around so long. It would be Herculean to make the kind of adjustments to fit the context of our new bigger system. And so they stop. What I want to say is, use us to learn the bigger system. Use us to identify these new opportunities, And then you can make those 5% changes to ease in, bring your audience along, bring your associates along, and ease into the evolution. But you have to understand the system is bigger than you, the culture is bigger than you. And I think that 20th century of we're just going to like do it to the customer and it's dead. That's not the context anymore.
Talking about these bigger systems, systemic thinking is also always a term that comes with strategic design. And the way I like when it really clicked for me is when I kind of visualized systemic thinking as going into this 3D architectural city almost, and kind of building those skyscrapers as institutions and systems and structures and stigmas that are currently in this frame where you're researching or where your brand is. And instead of like creating an idea and designing something on the outside and forcing it into the system, you are building it within the system, and then you kind of swerve around on your jetpack and kind of like either redesign those structures or work within them or work around them. So one example could be like if you have the creative idea of writing a book, there's a million ways to do that. But if you're in the real world, you're suddenly in the publishing industry, and it comes with a lot of constraints of like format, size, which genre you're writing, bestseller lists, and everything. And it's like really hard for you to work with these constraints unless you know what the system is like. So now there's self-publishing, which is a systemic change to publishing to make it more democratized. But yeah, that's like an example of maybe showing how important and valuable it is to understand this bigger system, and that the solution itself will be way more like ingrained if you work with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea of constraint, I always like to say like flip a constraint. You know, when I work a lot with startups, and I can always like predict what that first meeting is going to be like with certain startups, because they'll say, before we start, I have no people and I have no money. So in other words, they've told themselves that their mindset already has these constraints, these immovable walls. Of course, which I don't dive into that drama. And I say, okay, so that's your reality. But this, the story you've told yourself is now your biggest constraint. It's not about people and money anymore, because the stories that we've learned our whole lives since we were children, if we don't really take time to do self-audits, they become our biggest constraints, and it's got nothing to do with the world. It's how we see the world. It's how we limit our creativity. It's how we imagine our interaction with business or with the consumers, on and on and on into our personal life, right? So I think a lot of that is about sort of self-imposed constraints, which people need to sort of, check back in with themselves. I mean, I like to think about it this way, and you talked earlier about this, bigger system and everything's connected to everything. So if you imagine a jazz quartet, right? The concept of a jazz quartet is one of those kind of embodiments that I use to help people see what we're talking about. It's open-ended. It's an open network. You don't know who the leader is at any time. Every performance is different. They know their North Star. They know what song they're playing, but the goal is self-expression. The goal is co-accountability. If a jazz quartet from New York goes to Tokyo and there's a great drummer in Tokyo, they open their network and they have a magical evening. I use that analogy a lot because it can help people kind of imagine themselves in it. Even if you're not a fan of jazz, even if you've never seen a jazz quartet, you're not looking at a symphony orchestra, which is constructed and delineated, and there's first chair seat and second chair seat, and it's such an anomaly, or sort of an illustration of 20th century, right? So if you feel more free, then the strategist lives in that. That's why our methodologies that we talk about aren't the only methodologies. They're just more methodologies that add to, being a creative strategist or being a creative sort of business thought leader. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. They're not silver bullets, but they do reflect a changing society. So we can now join the conversation with a little more courage and a little less fear.
You talked a bit about how brands present themselves in public and become this identity that's relating to humans in more emotional ways. And I had to think about how you sometimes say, like, that's an old story, forget it. Because sometimes we have like things from when we were 15 that are still stuck in our head and kind of create these self-imposed constraints, like you say. So brands nowadays are complex adaptive systems that also move in these trends and systems and evolve with different user needs. And because they relate differently to humans, how do you think a human relates to a brand in the 21st century?
Well, I think as we sort of, again, it's the age of no trust. So part of what we grabbed onto in terms of brands is also we trusted brands. This brand always delivered this set of values to me. Sometimes that has changed as well. So we're a little mistrusting of brands, which means we latch on to the brands that really have become our life partner. Mm-hmm. And again, I always equate it, just so we can connect more personally, I equate it to like speed dating, right? Building a relationship, having a life partner, however you want to frame it, a brand is a living thing. It's not just one thing. A great brand, especially a great global brand, will continue to grow and change like we do. And sometimes we'll have this connection. Maybe 30 years down the road, we'll break the connection, whatever it is, just like we do with friends and family and loved ones. That's how I view brands. So when we're talking about brand opportunities, I always go to that place of, now I want my audience to wake up in the morning and think about that brand. I want them to, when they see the brand on, if it's an apparel brand or a fashion brand, when they see it on the street, they get a moment of joy. When they anticipate buying it, they get, all these sort of avenues of joy. That's a great brand. If a brand is locked, like perhaps some people are in terms of old stories, it's going to lose favor. And then the brand isn't truly a brand anymore. It's just a label. And a label is a transaction. I need this wooden table. I'm going to shop around for either the best price, my aesthetic. I want oak instead of maple. It's very transactional. There's no emotion involved. And once I make that transaction, then I start to use the table, right? Whereas a brand, even when I'm not using the brand, if I see the brand, if I hear about the brand, if it comes up in conversation, if it's now the new kind of benchmark in my mind, I see the world through that brand. Again, my favorite example is waiting 6 months for a Birkin bag and then paying more than a house for it. That's love.
Yeah.
That's love.
Brand love. Yeah.
It's brand love because the brand has never let us down. It moves and changes with us. It has, an understanding, even though it's not a human thing, it has an understanding that humans are key to its future. So I love brands. I've always loved brands. Yeah.
I like to categorize them into being a friend or a caretaker or a mentor. That's more of an academic hierarchy, or their higher self. And I think the higher self is the most important category because you, like I mentioned earlier, you kind of rationally buy into the brand again and again because it fits to your values and your lifestyle. And it kind of satisfies you more than a brand forcing themselves on you and creating this impulse purchase. So do you think these relationships that are created, if this brand is like more of an older sister to you or a daily caretaker when you feel sick, or do you think there's a new currency that's coming in now that's more human and is more about like creating memories, for example? Do you think there's a shift from like external KPIs to more emotional KPIs in the consumer?
Absolutely. And I think that's going to be the tough conversations to have. For example, don't ask me why, but I've been watching the Band-Aid brand recently because it's come into pop culture again. Now, Band-Aids were invented more than 100 years ago. And so when I look at those first 2 decades of the last century, there's a lot of parallels to where we are living in the third decade of this century. And I look at this thing called a Band-Aid, which has no competition, which has a unique place in our hearts, where the manufacturer, Johnson & Johnson, continues to be the driving sort of sub-brand or brand partner for so many retailers, so many distributors 100 years later. Like, what's that about?
Is Band-Aid a brand?
Band-Aid's a brand.
So, which was then coined like as the term. Okay.
Right.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah. No, and so
like
you just look at these moments where, an Oreo cookie.
Yeah.
Right? It was developed and debuted more than 100 years ago. Has no competition today. Now, there's a lot of chocolate cookies with cream, but there's only one Oreo. These moments, and Oreo continues to do a great job in evolving and changing. They just built did you hear about this hut they built where they're storing Oreos in case something happens to the planet so that future humans can have Oreos? Really? I mean, brilliant, brilliant marketing.
Yeah,
but also absolutely plausible. I don't want Oreos to go away, I mean, it's silly. But only they could do that.
Yeah.
Coke can do that.
Yeah.
Barbie can do that. There are these things that somehow tapped into the humanness of it. So even though the context of our lives is so dramatically different than 1920, right? We still are able to have this bigger sister or big brother or life partner or little brother, however you describe it, in our lives because they still connect with us in some way. That's the magic of these, being unique rather than being original. There's a lot of Starbucks. Now, maybe, I'd love to work with Starbucks today because I think they perhaps have lost their way a little bit. But when Starbucks started, over the next 2 or 3 decades, there were thousands of coffee shops that opened because they saw you and I hanging out in there. But those coffee shops have closed. And Starbucks continues to grow and change and thrive, and they have the reserve, and they're global. Like there's these moments of being unique that I think future brands have to tap into, which is sometimes you're going to be unique, you're going to be other. You might have 100 people that love you versus 1 million people that love you, but trust that in amount of time, and I don't know what that time will be, you'll have 1 million.
You're talking about this time frame of creating legacy brands that can almost dare to do more in a timeline. There's this concept of evolutionary versus revolutionary redesign. So the example I have is the KFC character logo versus the Olive Garden one. The KFC one always had their founder on there, always the same color palette, and only incrementally changed because of being this legacy that really didn't want to dilute their historic brand. Versus Olive Garden had a bold revolutionary redesign where they went from a very rustic, I actually love the old logo, from a very rustic Italian grapes logo to a modern golden one. So how do you know as a brand or as a startup, growth startup, whatever phase, how do you know if you have this potential of being a legacy and rarely changing your font, like Coca-Cola never really changed their font, versus when you actually require a massive shift right now?
I mean, I not to sound sort of like a broken record, but I believe it always goes back to your audience. You have to, rather than sitting in some boardroom somewhere and having intellectual conversations about what would be our next right step, because you've already drunk the Kool-Aid of your brand, right? So you're all going to nod and agree or, aggressively debate, but it's not really the truth. The truth is outside, because in my point of view, consumers and humans own brands. And what I mean by that is, Coca-Cola and its shareholders own the brand mark. I get that. Absolutely. I can't put a Coca-Cola name on just a sweatshirt. Like it's they own that. But what we're talking about, this emotional equity, we own that. We caused Apple to be the first trillion-dollar brand. We embraced Nike to be the most powerful sport brand. We did that. And I, just speaking from Nike, I spent many years there. Not that they're not geniuses and not that it's not a great brand and not that they're not creative. And, yes, the brand has to step up. But there's a lot of creative people out there. If the audience doesn't adopt it versus buy it, if they don't take it into their heart, it doesn't have that potential for equity. So now Apple's 3 trillion now? We did that as much as they did that.
I resonate with that we kind of own an emotional equity of a brand beyond kind of the normal KPIs that everyone keeps tracking. So maybe we can go into our last more personal chapter where we talk about how to use strategic design in your own life. I know that you like to do these personal sprints with us in class. And I started thinking about how strategic design is in my own life. And I think an example could be what we're doing right now is throwing ourselves into a podcast in front of cameras isn't something I would do on a regular day.
No, you wouldn't. No.
And I know you call this voluntary fear engagement, going back to the fear part as kind of constraint, but also as a guide towards continuously moving out of your comfort zone. And I think because of our convenience culture where we can order in everything, we work remotely, we can FaceTime, we don't have to really go out there and do anything anymore if we don't want to. We are shrinking that zone so much and we become anxious once we step out of it again. We kind of unlearned this vulnerability of change, and stepping back into that can be super valuable in your personal life once a massive change comes, or in business once a massive change comes, like AI, for example, because you've dealt with change before.
Right.
So you can deal with it in real time and just have the resources for it. So since you're a masters of design sprints and personal sprints, what are your 1 or 2 favorite sprints?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question because I love these moments of kind of going very focused and very narrow and deep into giving everyone just a moment to pause to say, how do I feel about the fear of failure? It's not necessarily, a course that's been accredited by the national, it's not about that. What it's about is these tiny sharp points that makes us human. So I want to, I love looking into the fear of failure. Just taking a moment in a silo in the context of your life. I love looking at time and energy. Throughout my career, I've seen and experienced a lot of teams who kind of, high five and fist bump because they hit a timeline deadline, but they're wrecked. The team is wrecked. Their spirit is wrecked. So that's why it's about integrating time and energy. That's another sort of personal sprint I look at so that I will say for myself, the minute I incorporated energy management into my life, I don't watch time anymore. It's amazing how that kind of changed in my life. And it's better. I show up in a better way for the interactions in my life because of it. Excuses. That's another personal sprint I love. We all have them. You know, again, it's like my example of the startup. I have no money, I have no people. Now let's talk about creating a brand that's going to take over the world, right?
Yeah.
Excuses. I didn't see the email. I didn't know which subway to take. I didn't know class was starting at this time. Well, I was raised in a small town. I don't know city living. Like, whatever those things are, yes, on the surface they seem really trivial, but it frames how we navigate life. So I was very much inspired. I don't know if you've ever done it, the Privilege Walk. It's an exercise that has been done at universities and also done in business. That's where I first experienced it, where you are asked very pointed human questions. If your answer is the affirmative, you step forward. If your answer is the negative, you step backwards. So you're all in a line to start. But the questions aren't like, you know, did your parents make six figures? The questions are, did you grow up with more than 50 books? Do you feel safe walking in the street with the person you love? Like all these human kind of questions. And you start to see how in any group, as beautiful and controlled as they can be, you never finish in a line. You always finish in this really exaggerated stagger because everyone has their diverse story that they bring to the table. And that's what really inspired me for these personal sprints. And I try to get to this sort of the root of what's going to be an obstacle for you as a creative strategist. Fear, energy, failure, changing your mindset. Again, this goes to what you were saying earlier in terms of stories that we tell ourselves. That's the biggest life constraint. It's not, I don't have the right space and I don't have the right, I don't have a love and I don't have a job. And it's, you got to start there. Because usually those are really old stories that you have to believe when you wake up every morning, because you kind of have to believe what you believe to be true, like to just go through life, right? So it takes a lot of courage to question it. And then we talked about, another one of my favorites is about flipping constraints. So instead of saying, all of these preconceived notions that are out there that are going to limit my creativity and my courage, my journey, what if I look into those and flip them? How are all of those going to be uniquely an ad for my strategy, for my process? How can I make it, I once, as a sort of random example, I once worked with this really amazing CEO, and she said to me when I was hired as a creative officer, I just want you to know I only read emails on my phone. So you have to write short sentences.
Yeah.
If you have at all written in your life, it's much harder to write short than it is to write long, which is why people usually have Zen sort of vomit of the mouth when they type. And it was an interesting constraint. At first I thought, how strange, how odd. And then it really made me a better writer, because now I was forced to communicate and take the time to write shorter. It's hard.
It is.
But it made me better. So in other words, I flipped the constraint as opposed to sort of how I started it. You mentioned unlearning earlier. At the end of the day, these personal sprints or these kind of personal challenges, unlearning is much, much harder than learning. Again, a human needs to wake up and believe what they believe is the truth. So to have the courage to unlearn that, to question that, it's really hard for some people. If you never knew Japanese, the Japanese language, I could teach it to you much easier than if you had already learned it, but learned it incorrectly. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, these sprints are ways to disrupt, sort of come out of left field, to surprise you, to delight you in some cases, because you might not have ever questioned this aspect of yourself before. And I think everything starts with us, especially as creative strategists that want to lead people through this chaos. If you don't have your narrative together, if you don't believe it, you're not going to be successful. You're not going to be able to really achieve, your life goals.
Do you have any tips on how to I keep imagining like your own timeline or energy timeline where you wake up and you feel a certain way and you have all these aura ring energy levels and start going into your day that was planned 2 months ago. Do you have any tips on how to show up for yourself but know where the balance is in energy management, basically?
Yeah, when it comes to energy, I think we know ourselves much, much better than we think we do. I think we step up and we give our energy away with both hands to our job. We give our energy away with both hands to our family, to our friends, to our classmates, to our volunteer cause, whatever it is. We give it away. And then we say at the end of the day, what's left for me? Oh, my vessel's empty. Okay, well, that's okay. I'll just nap. I'll be better. Whatever. And all I'm saying is, it's about integration. You are part of the life that you're leading. So instead of giving it away, energy away with both hands, I'm very kind of disciplined when I'm interacting. I dive deep when I need to dive deep, but I also know myself really well. So if I'm giving you, 3 hours, I'm thinking the other person I want to give 3 hours to is myself. And again, it won't always be like 3 hours to 3 hours. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I'm on my roster. It can't be I'm making everyone else's dream come true but mine. I'm making everyone's life full of joy but mine. And that's where the energy is. Because time, just sort of managing time, I don't know. It's not always going to bring you where you want to be.
It's external.
Brought.
Like, it's not human.
It's a left brain concept.
Yeah.
Energy is more of a right brain concept. It's joy, it's passion, it's excitement. And I'm more of a right brain guy. I mean, most of us have that balance or that integration between right and left brain. And that's why I think energy just clicked with me. So I can be here, but then I want to know, when am I going to be here for me?
Well, Edward, thank you so much. I think that's the perfect ending, going from like very systemic thinking to using strategic design for yourself, and kind of, I love this idea of integrating job, or like you call like creation, instead of calling it job.
Yeah, I also think, sorry to interrupt, is the idea of balance. I think we have to sort of put that aside for now. I'm not sure balance is possible in the 21st century. That's why I use the term integration. Yeah.
Yeah, I think balance could maybe have this excuse mindset again. And integration is more so about evaluating that you are a human who can wake up with a certain amount of energy, or like life happens before your meetings and after your meetings. So I think it's very inspiring to take this strategic design concept also into your personal life. Really changed my life, for example.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so I hope this will inspire a lot of businesses, students, anyone struggling with creative confidence and fear of going outside into a very rapidly changing world. And I always feel so much more inspired after talking to you.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you so much.